I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Did America have a Christian founding? That's the title of historian Mark David Hall's outstanding new book and the topic of today's BreakPoint Podcast. As Hall relates, it's a complicated question because first we have to ask, what do we mean by Christian? Did the founders identify as Christian? Or would it be more fair to say that they were influenced by Christian political reflection? And while historians focus on American founding luminaries like Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, they were hardly representative, religiously speaking, of the vast majority of Americans and other but less known American founders. Mark David Hall is the Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics at George Fox University. Here he is with Colson Center President John Stonestreet.
Well, welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time, and the publication of a new book is affording that opportunity. First met Mark David Hall from George Fox University at an event that we did. Mark, it was at Cedarville University, right, on religious liberty?
That's right. Yeah, that was a great event.
It was a great event. It was several years ago, and been following what you've been up to since. Mark has a BA in political science from Wheaton College, a PhD in political science from the University of Virginia. He's the director of the John Dickinson Forum for the Study of America's Founding Principles. Well, that's a big acronym. I don't even know how you could pronounce that.
Yeah, it is.
But he is the Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics at George Fox University. And his new book is called Did America Have a Christian Founding? Separating Modern Myth from Historical Truth. Let's walk through it. When you ask the question, did America have a Christian founding? That seems, even the question itself needs to be defined a little bit, right? Which is, to have a Christian founding, is it founded on Christian principles? Were the founders themselves Christians? Is it possible to have Christian founders who don't have Christian principles themselves, right? There's a lot of questions here. So walk us through kind of the landmines.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And that's pretty much the first chapter of the book, defining what I mean by Christian founding. To begin with, we have to decide when America was founded. Are we talking about early colonial settlements, the war for independence, or the creation of our constitutional order? And I think you need to walk through each of those. And I argue, just not to give away too much, but to let you know that each of these, I think, could be considered a founding, and each are heavily informed by Christianity. The more interesting question, I think, for you and me and your listeners is, what exactly do we mean by Christian? And here, if we simply mean the identification of the founders, by far and away, all of them pretty much would have called themselves Christian, 98% Protestant, about 2% Roman Catholic. There may be 2,000 Jews in America in the late 18th century. So certainly these folks would have all identified themselves as Christians, although of different denominations, Congregationalists, Anglicans, Quakers. But that's not a very interesting finding because, as you suggest, someone might identify himself as a Christian and yet be drinking deeply at the wells of the Enlightenment. They might embrace radically Christian views. And so in the final analysis, I say the interesting question is, were America's founders influenced by Christian ideas or ideas developed within the Christian tradition of political reflection? And here I think the answer is unequivocally yes, they were.
So what you hear, though, from oftentimes secular sources is the answer to that question is a definitive no, that it was Enlightenment, that there's a mirroring of for example, at some levels of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, I'm assuming. So how do you answer that challenge?
Yeah, to begin with, what I do, each chapter begins with about 30 quotations from prominent scholars and popular authors who say things like, most of America's founders were deists, many of America's founders were deists, America has a godless constitution. So you're exactly right. That's maybe even the consensus in the academy. So those ideas are out there. And what I show is there's just very little evidence to support them, particularly once we bother to define terms, like what do we mean by deist? Usually, what most people would think is a clockmaker God, right? A God who creates a world and then steps away from it and doesn't interfere, it doesn't intervene in the affairs of men and nations. If that's what we mean by deism, it's not clear to me any of America's founders were deists, with the possible exception of Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine, if we count him as an American. Now, it's true that a Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, at least late in life, embraced some clearly heretical ideas, but that's not the same thing as being a deist. But even when we turn beyond a couple of these elite founders to look at the founding generation, we see that Jefferson and Adams very much are outliers in terms of their theological beliefs.
One of the things I thought was interesting is even what we mean when we even use the term deist, what level of providence? Because that seems to me, even if you look at a Voltaire or you look at a Thomas Jefferson that are oftentimes quickly called deist, Jefferson seemed to have a pretty strong sense that providence was moving in history.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and he certainly speaks in official proclamations and this sort of thing as if God does intervene in human affairs. Jefferson may be doing that for rhetorical purposes. I'm willing to concede that. Some of them might be using language like that for rhetorical purposes. But someone like a George Washington is always speaking about God intervening in human affairs in private letters and public proclamations and informal speech. And so to call Washington a deist, I think is just completely ahistorical, or we have to redefine deist. And some scholars do this to say, well, a deist believes that God can intervene in human affairs. But that's, again, kind of redefining words to reach an outcome that I think you want to find.
Do you think there's there's been a push among secular historians to kind of remake the founders into their own image?
I think a couple of things are going on. One is that there is a sort of desire to find a useful past. And so academics and jurists and others might go back looking for certain things that they want to find. And they very much like the narrative that America had this Enlightenment rationalist founding. The founders wanted the strict separation of church and state and that sort of thing. So they're going back looking for it. I also think that that scholars are attracted to a relatively small handful of founders, the four who became president: Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Adams, maybe a Hamilton, especially after the play, and maybe a Ben Franklin.
My kids love the play, by the way.
They
know all the lyrics that are clean. We use the clean version, but it's a remarkable feat of art, I think.
No, it is, absolutely. The problem is this is a very unrepresentative sample of founders. Basically, all the men I just mentioned, with the exception of John Adams, were Anglicans or were worshiping in Anglican churches by the end of their lives. But Anglicans are only about 15% of America's population in the late 18th century, whereas Calvinists are 50 to 75%. And this group is almost completely neglected as well. Think about Franklin spent over half of the last 35 years of his life in Europe. Jefferson and Adams spent significant time in Europe. Hamilton was born in Jamaica and immigrated to America. These are very unrepresentative founders. And so I think some scholars are maybe just led astray. They look really carefully at a Jefferson and Adams, a Franklin, and then they generalize from these very interesting and important men, but they generalize from them to the American population. And that's just wrong. It would be sort of similar to looking really carefully at a Clarence Thomas, a Michael Steele, a J.C. Watts, all African-American conservatives, and then generalizing from this very small, select, and unrepresentative group to all African-Americans today. It would simply be misleading. It would really be false. It's a very unrepresentative sample.
Mark, you said at the beginning that one of the questions is, when is America's foundings? And we've been talking, specifically about kind of the Revolutionary era. But obviously, you go back earlier, and it seems like the evidence in terms of the settlements and so on is even stronger. But there's also been historical controversy there, right? I mean, what did they have in mind? Were they really about religious liberty? Were they about this new kind of opportunity for financial exploitation? How do you answer that one?
I think the evidence is most clear when we talk about America's earliest colonies. I mean, really almost no one disputes that the New England Puritans and Pilgrims were trying to create godly commonwealths. They weren't committed to religious liberty in the abstract. They wanted to create commonwealths in which they could exercise their religious convictions as they saw best. They weren't able to do that in England or Holland, so they came over here to do it. There was more religious liberty than is oftentimes admitted, but they banned Quakers, they banned Jesuits. They were not committed to religious liberty in the abstract. What's more interesting, I spend more time, is if you go down south, you actually find these colonies were a lot more concerned about religion than is oftentimes realized. The fundamental orders of Virginia punished blasphemy, required church attendance, things like that. Even tolerant Quaker Pennsylvania had religious tests for office. The government was involved in punishing all sorts of vices, including plenty of things that you and I would think are ridiculous. Stage plays and things like this would be punished by the state because they were deemed to be corrosive. So I think the early American colonies, people were attracted by economic gain. Of course they were. but religion was very, very important from north to south. So if by America's founding we talk about the early colonial settlements, I think the case there is easiest. Clearly, these folks were motivated in very important ways by their Christian convictions.
I guess one of the anachronisms that I see from historians trying to, over-secularize America's foundings at either one of those eras is this idea about religion and about how we think the place of religion should be today versus back then. Whether you're talking about kind of Charles Taylor's secularization idea, the sense that religion is this personal, private conviction is a way we understand religion today. That's not how they understood what religion was and how important it was back then.
That's exactly right. This is a very modern understanding of religion. For America's founders, again, from the early colonial settlements well into the 19th century, but particularly in the late 18th century, if we can focus there. Yeah, religion is something that you lived, that you breathed. It certainly impacted what you did throughout your life. There's no mistake that the First Amendment protects a free exercise of religion. If you look, some recent presidents spoke only of a freedom of worship, with the suggestion that religious liberty is something you do in the church or synagogue or mosque. Not at all. Of course it includes that. The government shouldn't step into a church, synagogue, or mosque and tell religious leaders what to do. But it also protects Americans as they go throughout their everyday lives, as they act as bakers or butchers or firemen. Of course, religion should impact what one does, and it should impact public policy. One of my favorite examples I give of this is Pennsylvania. In about 1780, I think it was, they said, well, we recognize that liberty is a very important gift of God. It's something that all people should have, and therefore we cannot have slavery in our Commonwealth. They're making explicitly Christian arguments for outlawing slavery, and no one would challenge that, really. Of course, you should let your Christian convictions and moral convictions inform public policy with respect to slavery in very important ways.
Shane Morris here again. We'll get right back to John Stonestreet and Mark David Hall. 2019 has been one of the most successful years yet for BreakPoint and the Colson Center. We've enjoyed hearing from listeners like you about the impact of BreakPoint commentaries and podcasts on your lives, your thinking, and your ability to relate to the current culture from a Christian perspective. In 2020, we want to continue to provide you the clarity you need on issues you care about. If you value the movement of good ideas and want to bring others in on it, please consider supporting us by giving online at breakpoint.org/podcast before the year ends. Thanks very much. Now, back to John Stonestreet and Mark David Hall.
So I guess one of the questions that I think some folks have, because this has been such a kind of a heated argument, was America's founding Christian? Was it even religious? Was it deistic? Was it secular? Why does it matter? And I think it's two questions. Like, why does it matter then? But also, why does it matter today? We're an evolving nation. We're different than what we were. We had slavery back then. We're morally better. And I think that's an important question to be able to kind of respond to. How would you do that?
Oh, I think it's a great question. Yeah, my wife kept asking me that as I did. It does in academic books.
You're taking all the time to write the book, yeah.
That's right. She just kept saying, so what? Why does it matter? Well, it matters for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's important just to have our history right? We want an accurate account of America's history. If I was writing a book on Saudi Arabia, of course I would talk about the influence of Islam in that nation state. It would only make sense, right? And it would be utterly ridiculous to try to write a history of Saudi Arabia and ignore Islam. So just getting history right in and of itself is a good thing. With respect to America's founding, though, politicians are routinely appealing back to the founders for guidance. And so I think in our political debates, it's relevant. With respect to jurisprudence, it's absolutely relevant. The U.S. Supreme Court made it crystal clear in Jefferson versus the Board of Education, a 1947 case, that we have to look to the founding era to define meaning of the religion clauses. And I think here, clearly America's founders wanted a very robust understanding of religious liberty, including the protection of religious citizens from general neutrally applicable laws. And maybe we could talk about that later. But also, they had a view that the church and state do not need to be strictly separated, that there shouldn't be a wall of separation between church and state. Now, there are many ways the state should not interfere with the church, for sure, and there's good biblical and theological reasons for keeping the state out of the business of promoting Christianity or a particular church. but there are plenty of ways in which the two can cooperate. So, for instance, Missouri had a program that provided safe playground surfaces for various entities. And a Lutheran preschool applied for and would have received a grant, but Missouri said, oh, we can't do that because of the strict separation of church and state. Well, the founders never intended that sort of thing. And in fact, you could look at that case as the state acting in a sort of anti-religious way. America's founders never would have required that sort of outcome. And the Supreme Court, fortunately, in this case, sided with the Lutheran preschool. So these preschoolers have safe playground surfaces, and that's a very good outcome.
Yeah, that is. And we talked a lot about that case. And that to me is such an interesting one because so many of the conflicts around religious liberty today have to do with kind of the collision with LGBT rights and sexual freedoms and so on. But, this really gets to the heart, or at least that Trinity Lutheran case really got to the heart of, look, can the state participate at some level? Should it stay away at all cost? I think the big cross monument case we've been talking about is another example, of that as well. And it does get back to this thing that we hear, this wall of separation between church and state. I know that has a very specific historical source, and many people would say it's been misunderstood. Walk us through that.
Sure. Well, the reference, of course, is to a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists in 1802, where he said that the First Amendment creates a wall of separation between church and state. Now, it's very important to note to begin with that Jefferson played no role in writing or ratifying the First Amendment. So why we should turn to him as someone to shed light on this is beyond me. And I address this at some detail in the book. And there are arguments, but I think I disposed of them pretty well. The actual Establishment Clause, if you think about it for a minute, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That only binds the state. It doesn't affect the church at all. Whereas a wall of separation, that metaphor suggests that the church shouldn't interfere with the state and the state shouldn't interfere with the church. So it's a very problematic metaphor. If you look at the founding era, you see almost no evidence that America's founders wanted to create a wall of separation between church and state. One of Congress's first actions, the first federal Congress, was to repass the Northwest Ordinance, which says religion and education is necessary for a free people. Congress made itself available to have church services in the U.S. Capitol building. Jefferson made the War and the Treasury Departments available for church services. Presidents issued calls for prayer and fasting. Again, there's all sorts of ways in which the founders thought the state could encourage and promote Christianity. Some of them might be inappropriate, and we could discuss that, and particularly in this far more pluralistic era. Again, in the late 18th century, 98% of Americans are Protestants, almost 100% of Americans, and by which I mean Americans of European descent, are Christian. And so maybe some things were appropriate in the late 18th century that would not be as appropriate in the 21st century, and we can talk about that. But as a matter of jurisprudence, as a matter of the Establishment Clause, there is no wall of separation between church and state.
Let's talk about some of those things. I'm curious that since you brought it up, what are some government endorsements or support of religion from the 18th century, 19th century that you think would be inappropriate today?
Sure. Well, for instance, the Continental Confederation Congress and the early presidents often issued very explicitly Christian calls for prayer and fasting or Thanksgiving Day proclamations. It seems to me only prudent that if a president today, and all presidents have issued these, right? Barack Obama, George Bush, Donald Trump, that they be more inclusive, that they not be distinctively Protestant. That would just simply be a matter of political prudence and civic friendship. We don't want people to feel that they're not full citizens of the United States of America. Again, it would be constitutionally permissible for a president to issue a very Protestant Thanksgiving Day proclamation. I just don't think it would be prudent.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting idea. Well, and that really underscores, too, many of us talk about religious liberty in America. We forget that some of the states did not, really tolerate other religions. And one of the big ones was the difference between Protestant and Catholic. Give us a little bit of that history. There's been a history of conflict in America about that, hasn't there?
There has been, but I have to say it's a pretty appealing story in many ways. So I teach at George Fox University. I'm sure you recognize George Fox as a founder of the Quakers, the French tradition. Quakers were always having a hard time running afoul of the state because they take Jesus literally at his word, right? To love your enemies, to turn the other cheek. So they were pacifist and they refused to serve in the militia. And yet all early American colonies required militia service. Quakers also refused to swear oaths, again, taking Jesus literally, where he says, swear not at all. And so Quakers in England were thrown in jail routinely, and many died in jail. In America's colonies, oftentimes these colonies voluntarily crafted accommodations or protections to allow the Quakers, for instance, to affirm rather than swear, to do some sort of alternative service rather than serve in the militia. Now, these things did develop over time. So in the 17th century, Quakers sometimes were banned from the colonies altogether. But by the time we get to the early 18th century, every colony went out of its way to protect the Quakers. And this sort of thing is found in the U.S. Constitution. If you think about the Article 2 oath of office for the president can swear or affirm. This is a built-in religious accommodation to permit Quakers who don't swear oaths to be president of the United States. James Madison, when he proposed what became the Second Amendment, actually would have had constitutional protection for Quakers who objected to military service. He did lose that battle. The Senate killed his proposal and he was unable to save it. But in the first National Militia Act, this sort of religious accommodation was built in. So again, I don't want to tell too wiggish of a story. Certainly, you're absolutely right that Quakers weren't always protected. Roman Catholics were discriminated against and not permitted to hold civil office in many states. In the 19th century, we saw a huge rise of anti-Catholicism. And that is something I don't get into my book, but I think it's a very important part of the tale about how some Americans came to embrace the separation of church and state. Basically, it was a movement to discriminate against Roman Catholics, to keep Catholics from getting a share of taxpayer dollars for their Catholic schools. So the separation of church and state really, as we've come to know it, is a late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon, almost always driven by anti-Catholicism.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, look, we got just a few minutes left, and I appreciate the approach of the book, Mark. I appreciate the clarity about when we ask the question, did America have a Christian founding? We need to really define what we mean by that. And I think that's exactly right, that the most interesting question is, was it a particularly Christian view of life in the world that had the influence here? And let me ask you this here as we close out. If the answer to that question is a specific degree, yes, what are the specific Christian ideals that you think had the most impact in America's founding?
Oh, that's a great question. I love that question. I think the fact that humans are created in the imago Dei, the image of God, and therefore all humans should be respected and treated well. I think the idea that individuals are rights bearers, that these rights derive from a God-created natural law, that these include things like religious liberty, a very robust understanding of religious liberty, which, as you suggested, is under increasing assault today. I think the founders' understanding of liberty is very important. Since the mid-19th century, we tend to think about liberty as being the freedom to do whatever we want, except for physically harm someone else. The founders had a much more constrained view of liberty. Basically, for them, liberty was the ability to do what is right. So the idea that you would have a liberty or freedom to do something that's wrong, to use profanity in public or publish pornography, that was just inconceivable to America's founders. And so I think we could do very well to look back to their understanding of liberty, at least to inform how we live our lives, if not informing law and public policy.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to have that understanding of liberty that's informed by morality, that kind of fundamentally puts into the system space for non-governmental institutions to have influence, right? Because you're going to get these moral norms, these cultural norms from someplace other than the Constitution necessarily.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And these things are incredibly important for America's founders. It's really striking if you go back and look at law books of legal codes from the era. Pretty much all the state ones fit into one volume. Government was far less intrusive. And the national government was not intended to do almost anything that it does today. If you go back and read Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, take it seriously, the national government is supposed to defend the nation, regulate interstate commerce, have a post office, a system of courts for certain limited purposes. But almost anything else, to the extent to which government should do it, it would be done by the states. And even there, oftentimes education, taking care of poor people, things like that, would be done by churches or other private associations. And I think we've lost a lot of that, and we should return to that.
Yeah, well, this is a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could keep going, but my guest today has been Dr. Mark David Hall. He is the Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics at George Fox University, and his new book is called Did America Have a Christian Founding? Separating Modern Myth from Historical Truth, published by Thomas Nelson. And this interview is just proof, Mark, that you've kind of dove deeply into these waters, and I love the clarity on why this question matters, because I think that's really such an important thing to understand in answering the question. I feel like we could keep going. I hope people will pick up a copy of the book. Again, it's called Did America Have a Christian Founding? Dr. Mark Hall, thanks for joining us today on the BreakPoint Podcast.
Thanks for having me, John.
You've been listening to John Stonestreet's interview with Mark David Hall, Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics at George Fox University. Hall's new book, Did America Have a Christian Founding?, is available at our online bookstore at breakpoint.org. And I want to remind you to consider making your tax-deductible donation to support BreakPoint. If you value your daily dose of sanity and want to support more content, more guests, and more good ideas like this in 2020, please go to breakpoint.org/podcast on your phone or computer and make your year-end gift today. That's breakpoint.org/podcast. Thanks. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.